This is Christopher Sernaque hosting episode 18 of season 5 of the Current Topics in Science podcast. This podcast will address breaking scientific news in light of the origins debate and host interviews with scientists. Today we'll be talking with Dr. Jonathan Sarfati about the origin of life and the research of Dr. James Tour. This podcast is available on the following platforms: iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and iHeartRadio. Video recordings of the podcast will be uploaded to YouTube. Enjoy the podcast. Today on Current Topics in Science, we have the honor of hosting Dr. Jonathan Sarfati. Dr. Sarfati has a Bachelor of Science with honors in chemistry with condensed matter and nuclear physics papers substituted, and a PhD in spectroscopy and physical chemistry. His logical reasoning shines through his works, perhaps stemming from his chess expertise. He was awarded the title of FIDE Master in 1988. Dr. Sarfati is currently the author and the co-author of numerous scientific papers and apologetic books, including his most widely sold creation classic, Refuting Evolution, which is designed to help high schoolers navigate the evolutionary theory. He's also the author of the critically acclaimed commentary on the first book of the Bible called the Genesis Account. And he has 14 recorded DVD lectures, has co-authored over 500 articles for Creation Ministries International, dealing with everything from apologetics, ethics, to interviews he's conducted with other scientists and theologians. Most importantly, Dr. Sarfati has a deep love for God and his beloved wife Chevy and the rest of his loved ones. And now, without further ado, good afternoon, Dr. Sarfati. How was your day, and how are you doing?
Yeah, good day, Christopher, and everyone else in the audience.
Thank you for coming on Current Topics in Science again, Dr. Sarfati. It's good to have you back. And now, since this is Current Topics in Science, let's quickly take a look at this week's current topic. Professor James Tour, back in May of 2023, recently engaged in a debate entitled, "Are We Clueless About the Origin of Life?" At the beginning of the debate, in his opening statement, Dr. Tour said, "An anti-purity means that one mirror image of a molecule prevails to the exclusion of the other. This includes 19 of the 20 amino acids, the monomeric sugars, the nucleotides, and the lipids. But for the sake of getting through, I'm conceding tonight to my opponent all those small molecules in 100% enantiomeric purity." Dr. Sarfati, do you believe that these molecules pose a problem to the origin of life?
Well, I think Dr. Tu is very generous in conceding that, because that's one of the major problems of origin of life research, is to try to get the molecules in enantiomeric purity. Now, to explain what this means, things like amino acids and sugars come in mirror image forms. One's right-handed, one's left-handed. See, they're mirror images. They don't, like, I can't fit my left hand in a right-handed glove and vice versa. And since the enzymes depend on the spatial orientation of their atoms, they need to have this purity. And also the sugars for the RNA and DNA backbone have to be the same candidates, otherwise you can't get the double helix form, which means they are not capable of reproduction or storing information. So life, it needs this. And Tor has been very generous to say, well, I'm going to concede this. We're not even going to talk about it because it hasn't been solved. And it's notable. I've studied this for decades, actually, literally. And I read from time to time, oh, we've finally solved the problem of enantiopurity. Well, hang on, that means the previous time they said that didn't solve it. And it happens over and over again. They're admitting the previous attempts didn't solve it, and the same is going to happen to them as well. They really are not solving the problem at all, because just one thing, the wrong sugar in the RNA will stop the it from replicating as a template. Just one thing is wrong that destroys the ability to replicate. So it's a very important thing, and Torres is saying, well, okay, let's assume we've got this. And by the way, it's not even a stable situation, because amino acids will tend to revert back to the 50-50, called the racemic mixture of 50 left, 50 right. And this happens especially when you have alkaline conditions that really produces this racemization. So Tor is conceding a great deal to be generous as possible to his opponent.
Thank you for covering that section of Dr. Tour's opening statement. As Dr. Tour continued, he listed 5 criteria needed for a valid hypothesis on the origin of life. He listed them as follows. 1. Polypeptides equal proteins and enzymes. 2. Polynucleotides equal RNA. 3. Polysaccharides equal carbohydrates. And then 4. The origin of specified information in the above polymers. And 5. Assembly of the above components into an integrated, functional living system, namely a cell, not a merely randomly mixed system. Dr. Sarfati, is there evidence that the origin of life research has met these 5 criteria? And if not, why do these 5 criteria pose a problem for a materialistic and unguided origin of life?
Well, it's interesting that the people who are experts in the field realize that we're a long way from solving it. I mean, I've looked at other analyses of this debate, like one Steve McRae, who's a friend of mine. He's agnostic and doesn't like young earth creation, but we get on pretty well. But he did a video with 2 other non-theists, and they all agree that Farina did not answer Dr. Tour's chemical points. And there's another video where an origin of life researcher called Dr. Paul Rimmer also agreed we may be hundreds of years from solving the problem. I think it's not going to be solved. Dr. Tour actually is not saying going that as far as I would, because we really can't know what's going to happen in the future. I think it's going to be a problem, but they all agree that these problems haven't been solved, while Farina, who's not really much of a chemist, he's a failed master's student in chemistry, he didn't solve it. He citation bluffed. He said, well, here are these papers that solve it. When you look at the papers, they don't really say what he claims they say. And, of course, in a debate, what you're going to try and do is show rather than tell, and he just didn't tell. Well, Dr. Tour wrote these things. Here's what you need to do. Go ahead and show it how it was done. And he couldn't. In fact, the last thing is an important thing, because what you could say is that, okay, supposing I give you all the proteins and all the RNA and the DNA and the lipids you want, put them in a can somewhere, see if a cell's going to form. I'll give you any chemicals you want. Show that a living cell is going to form from them. They can't even do that. Okay, see, every one of those is a problem, because one thing that Dr. Tour points out, which I think Farina totally missed, is that you're not going to get these reactions happening in water, because when these things join together, they give off a water molecule. So if it's in water, the reaction is going to go the other way, where the water molecule comes in and breaks apart the bond. And Tour is quite right that these reactions do not occur in water. A synthetic organic chemist such as himself, one of the best in the world, he excludes water from all the reactions, because he knows that's the last place you want to have these polymerization reactions going. In fact, he'd probably add things like, which are called condensing agents, that pull off this water to help to make the reaction go in the direction of polymerization. And that's one of the things that Farina could not solve. Now, at that point, to a point, something else that Farina missed is that some of these things, like amino acids, have other groups on them. Like you got an extra amino group in lysine, you have an extra carboxyl group in aspartic acid. See, what's to stop those parts bonding, so you get a whole lot of branching instead of the straight chains you need for proteins? You have a lot of branching going on, and I think Farina didn't seem to miss the point completely. And the same goes with RNA and DNA. These sugars have a lot of different spots where they could join together, but only the 3' and 5' is going to form RNA or DNA that can actually form a double helix and therefore store information and transmit this information. The 2' that would get formed if you just bung these things together would not form information capable RNA. So that's an issue as well. And he pointed out, I think, carbohydrates. You've got lots of different places that carbohydrates can join and form branches as well. So it's going to be a jumble if you try and just bung the chemicals together and try and get them to react. It just doesn't work that way.
Thank you for covering those 5 points, Dr. Sarfati, on the chemical criteria. Speaking of which, on your Twitter comments about the debate, you had stated, he, Dr. Tour, knows the most important thing. Little things like equilibrium, reaction kinetics, how to stop the reaction at just the right time, controlling temperature and pH, purification, and much more. Dr. Sarfati, what is the essential knowledge in the field of chemistry, and can you share the results of your own personal published research in chemistry?
I can give you some examples of what Tor is talking about, which comes from some of his view as well as some of the things I've talked about as well. Like, for instance, to make sugars, the thing like ribose, you start with formaldehyde and use alkali, and sometimes the formaldehyde combines to make a whole jumble of sugars, not just ribose. Okay, it's a whole jumble of stuff. But if you let the reaction go on a bit further, then the sugars will decompose by the Cannizzaro reaction. So the very condition that will form the sugars will also destroy the sugars if you don't stop the reaction at the right point. Now, in another paper that Farina brought up, trying to sort of work out how amino acids could join together. Now, my friend Dr. Royal Truman, who's a PhD organic chemist, he's written an unpublished paper. It's not published yet on this particular experiment. One thing he points out, you have carbonyl sulfide is produced in trace amounts in volcanic eruptions. The volcanic eruptions are quite acidic, but then the experiment used a very alkaline condition stuff and bubbled pure carbonyl sulfide through the mixture, which is alkaline, to get some minor polymerization, only one, two or three things put together. But the point is, how in the primordial earth do you go from this trace stuff in an acid to pure carbonyl sulfide in an alkali? You see, again, that's what I mean about he's controlling the pH, the acidity or alkalinity, and stopping the reaction. But and as a purification, so you got this reaction to produce ribose produces so much other crap as well, and so somehow the organic chemist has to purify it, or normally he'll skip that step and just buy the stuff. That every time you buy the stuff from a chemical purification company and then go to the next step. But the problem also would not have all this stuff going.
Dr. Sarfati, continuing with your comments on Twitter about the debate, are we clueless on the origin of life? You had stated, in a cell, replication needs individual activated nucleotide joining on whatever template is provided. An artificial experiment of joining pre-designed matching activated is irrelevant. How would a primordial soup produce those matching strands? Dr. Sarfati, may you further clarify this quote? Is this process of subreplication a problem for the origin of life?
Oh, well, it certainly is. See, one thing, the reason that RNA and DNA can be information storage molecule is that there's no preferred sequence coming from the chemistry any more than there's a preferred origin of ink molecules on a piece of paper. So the fact that we can actually arrange the ink molecules depends on them not having a preferred arrangement where they go where we want them to go. The same with DNA and RNA. They can only store information if there's no chemical determination of the sequence that will be formed. And so if for living things, they have to copy the information digitally from one strand of DNA or RNA to another. So it's one by one nucleotide joining on, and it's supposed to copy whatever's provided for it with no preferred sequence. Now, there was a 2009 paper by Joyce and Lincoln about supposed replication of an RNA enzyme. Now, I wrote about this at the time. Back when it was published, I wrote a little article about this. And the point is they were not doing that. What they had is a certain RNA enzyme, and they made two halves of it, which totally matched. They had matching complementary strands and activation. So all this was doing was a ligation, which is joining these things together that matched perfectly with the template. So the point is, where would you get these totally matching templates from on a primordial Earth? I mean, the whole point is trying to work out how do these polymers arise in the first place, but you've already given you polymers of a particular sequence. Where did they come from? You can't say natural selection produced them because there's no natural selection before you have replication. And this is supposed to be about how you explain replication in the first place. So it's totally irrelevant to what origin of life has to do. No living thing though finds a pre-made template and just joins those two halves. You've got to actually make them one by one. And this before they decompose, because you know why, for instance, the RNA vaccines are stored at very low temperatures, because RNA is a very unstable molecule. And so for people like Farina to talk about RNA as a living thing, he's actually undermining the real chemistry that we know. RNA is very unstable. I mean, Dr. Carter's has done work in DNA and RNA. He's a geneticist, and he said DNA is quite unstable, but RNA, you can almost forget about trying to preserve it for very long times. And when you're talking about a primordial soup, RNA is going to die really quickly.
That was incredible, Dr. Sarfati. Continuing with your commentary on the debate, you posed a challenge to those who believe in the naturalistic origin of life. And with that in mind, what evidence do we have of the fine-tuning in the chemistry of life? May you list several examples?
Well, okay, some of this is sort of a precursor to the whole thing of how there are constants in the universe that have to be very finely tuned even to get atoms and molecules forming. Never mind life from other things. If you can't get atoms or molecules, you're not going to get life. And only a very tiny fraction of possible fundamental constants actually will give you atoms or molecules. Okay, that's some sort of big picture thing. But as for sort of the slightly smaller picture, you need to have hundreds of enzymes to produce even the simplest living thing. And they have to have a lot of stuff exactly right, because remember, enzymes work because they have a very fine spatial arrangement that matches what they're trying to react, and only a tiny fraction of possible arrangements would produce the right shape to have enzymes. And then you've got to have the coding for these enzymes on the DNA. So it's a lot of stuff had to go right before life could even start.
Thank you for outlining those challenges, Dr. Sarfati. Although I think the question is begged, since life is so finely tuned, is it possible that life could exist in some other form? For instance, could life be based on silicon instead of carbon? If not, is carbon-based life optimally designed?
Well, it's one of the key difference is that carbon dioxide is a gas that's very soluble in water. Silicon dioxide is a solid that's very insoluble in water. That's a key problem. And that shows there's a big difference between the way silicon and carbon bonds. I mean, also silicon and hydrogen bonds are not that stable. Carbon and hydrogen bonds are quite stable. So a lot of different things would have to go. For silicon, doesn't seem to be the right sort of thing. Silicon is great material to build rocks. Rocks are basically silicate minerals because of the silicon-oxygen interaction. Carbon is very good for living things that have to be much more dynamic than rocks. So I think silicon is just not. It's in the realms of fantasy, not in the realms of anything really chemical.
Dr. Sarfati, it sounds like you're saying that life has been optimally designed. In the debate, the Joyce-Lincoln paper, Self-Sustained Replication of an RNA Enzyme, was referenced as evidence that life could have originated without a designer. Can you explain whether or not the Joyce-Lincoln paper demonstrated chemical evolution?
I think earlier I pointed out that the Joyce-Lincoln paper was about ligation of pre-designed matching activated templates. So this RNA strand can join two activated halves of itself. That's all it does. It's totally irrelevant to what living things have to do, and it requires very chemically advanced stuff to start with, because RNA is just not something that's going to be produced in a primordial soup. The primordial soup is trying to destroy the RNA as soon as it's formed. As I said, it's very unstable. Okay, now Dr. Tour is talking about the polymerization of amino acids in water, which is, again, it's not something that happens in water. He also pointed out that Farina could not show how to stop a third group from combining and causing branching. Okay, but amino acids have two groups that can join. But what happens if you've got molecules with only one group? See, what that would do is terminate the chain. It can only grow on one side. So you're actually blocking the chain from growing if you have a lot of these molecules that are monofunctional. one functional group. Amino acids are bifunctional, two or trifunctional, like lysine or aspartic acid. But the thing is, when you look at the Miller-Urey experiments, the famous ones with the sparking of gases and then collecting stuff in a trap there, they produce about 5 times as much formic acid as any amino acid. So what I'd really like to see is these guys try to do all their experiment by having lots of formic acid in the mixture. I can guarantee you it would not work. And I've got a quote from Dudley Irick about how he used to have to make things about 99.9 pure of the bifunctional. Just 0.1% of the monofunctional thing would actually block off the chains from growing. And that's something I've done in the lab myself, actually. I've made nylon as a sort of a demonstration experiment for schools and things. I make nylon, and I sabotaged that experiment by putting a little bit of acetyl chloride into the mixture. That was a monofunctional thing, and the thing totally it collapsed the experiment. The nylon was happily forming between the boundary between two liquids, and you draw the nylon come off, and more would form as you drew it off. A little drop of acetyl chloride broke. So I've done that experiment myself. Okay, I haven't published it anywhere, but it can be done. And this is what would really happen in a primordial soup. Would have this formic acid around, and they've not explained how you'd get rid of that stuff when it actually outnumbers the amino acids. So Tor talked about it's a thing with 3 functional groups. I'm talking about what about with 1 functional group? You see, neither of them mentioned that. I think it's a point in Dr. Tor's favor.
Thank you for taking a look at the Joyce Lincoln paper. Before we close off, I would appreciate it if you would also address comments from Paul Davies, an astrobiologist at Arizona State University who estimated the probability of life arising on its own. He said, "We don't know the mechanism whereby non-life turns into life, so we have no way of estimating the odds. It may be 1 in a trillion trillion. It's easy to imagine that. In which case, Earth life may be unique in the observable universe." Dr. Sarfati, is the probability for a naturalistic origin of life favorable?
Well, I mean, my own calculations say that it's even more unfavorable than what Dr. Davies estimates. I've actually calculated even if you have all the atoms of the known universe and all the seconds since the assumed Big Bang, you haven't got enough trials to get the precise sequences of enzymes and RNA to make even the simplest possible life. I think he's actually underestimated the odds, actually, if anything. And he also said something quite important, that most of what we know is actually not the hardware, but the information or software. And he's asked, well, there's no known physical process that can create information from nothing. And he asked, well, how did stupid atoms write their own information thereabouts? I've got a quote on that as well, that how did stupid atoms write their own programs? And that's something which I think wasn't covered, because I think the debate was more on the chemical side of things. And Dr. Tor talked about the information side, but I think it really wasn't covered that much. It was mainly focused on the underlying chemistry, which I think is actually secondary as importance to the underlying information, as Dr. Tor, I think, would agree as well. But it was good stuff what he presented. I mean, he presented good chemistry there, and he wrote all this formula on the blackboard so quick. He reminded me of my own chemistry professors who could, write, experts in carbohydrate chemistry. You could write the carbohydrate formulas really fluently. So it shows he really knows his stuff, the way he could do that.
Thank you for explaining that, Dr. Sarfati. And beyond the mathematical arguments against the naturalistic origin of life, would you say that there are biochemical reasons as to why life could not arise from non-life? For instance, can you give several chicken and egg or egg nymph grasshopper problems for abiogenesis?
Oh, yeah. Well, okay, so the point is, see, information on DNA is no use unless you can decode it. So you have loads of decoding machines, even in the simplest life, as incredibly complicated decoding machines. But the thing is, the instructions to build those decoding machines are themselves on the DNA. So you can't read those instructions without the decoding machinery, but you can't build the decoding machinery without these instructions. And that is a real problem for Origin of Life, trying to get both the decoding and the instructions for them when you need them both together. And that's why they've got got things like the RNA world has tried to do both, but in vain, though, because it seems that RNA can do one thing or the other. It can be a machine, or it can be a coding template. It can't do both. You see, to become a machine, the RNA has to join with itself. But to become a coding template, it has to be free. It can't be joined to anything else. Okay, so it can do one or the other. Okay, and also the decoding machines have to be extremely accurate. This is called the eigen paradox. Okay, so you can't allow more errors. See, if you've got n units in a chain of life, okay, if it's 100, the maximum error rate can be 1 over 100. If it's 1,000, the maximum is 1 over 1,000. So if something was even 99% accurate in decoding, it would not be good enough, because that 1% would actually produce a mistake in the decoding machine, which would produce a mistake in the decoding of the next generation, and so on. This is what we call error catastrophe. The thing would break down really quickly. And from a theological point, I'd say, well, this goes to Genesis, where God says it was good 7 times and concludes it was very good. And it seems that everything had to be made very good right from the start. It couldn't start from less than good and work its way up, because unless it's very good to start with, it's going to crash. And the egg nymph grasshopper thing is talking about things like the decoding machines use energy, and most of their energy comes from the molecule called ATP, adenosine triphosphate, and that's made by the tiniest motor in the universe called ATP synthase. But the thing is, to build the ATP synthase, you need the instructions of the DNA and decoding machines using ATP made by those motors. So that's a 3-way cycle. And my colleague and friend, Dr. Robert Carter, has actually drawn a thing which shows us a 3-way cycle is highly understated. That's the symbol version. He's got a graph of the real version, which is an incredible lot of stuff that has to be put together.
Dr. Sarfati, we've now arrived at our final question. Where can listeners go for more information?
My website is creation.com. That's an easy one to remember, hopefully, creation.com. And that actually has a page on origin of life arguments, a Q&A page. And there's also a review out of my friend and colleague, Dr. Don Batten's done a nice review article on the origin of life. There's also a good article by a colleague in New Zealand, Sean Doyle, which is how to look at origin of life research. Because, I mean, in my position as scientist of CMI, people ask questions about what about this latest paper on origin of life? And so what Sean has done is written an article. Well, how should I think about this? So you don't have to think about every single paper. How do I think about this stuff in general? So that's a good thing. But creation.com/origin, you should be able to find a lot of articles on this topic. I've been writing about this stuff for over 25 years. Okay, so you've got some of my articles going back to last millennium. But so I've been doing this for a while, including enantiomers, including polymerization, including things like purity of building blocks, all those sort of things. I've been writing for a long time on this.
Dr. Sarfati, thank you very much for your time. It was an absolute joy. And to our listeners, thank you very much for taking the time to learn with us on current topics in science, where scientific discoveries are examined in light of the origins issue. You can find Dr. Sarfati's biographical information, his credentials, and his written works in the description, where you'll also find links to the Evolution's Achilles Heels documentary at a discounted price, the CMI YouTube channel, and a link to the Christ Jesus Ministries merch store. Please share and subscribe to the Current Topics in Science podcast. It's available on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and iHeartRadio. Thanks again for listening, and remember, the truth saves.